Okay, let's move on to the second memoir that's in the book, the memoir by Ukraine, Viktor Petrakevich. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Petrakevich, yeah.
Petrakevich. And he was in Stanislav when World War I began, ended up in Buczacz. And his diary was in his son's hand until 1956. He was a high school teacher, fought for the national cause rather than survival of the empire in World War I. And he served in the Ukrainian Galician army that fought against the Poles at the end of the war also. Born in 1883 in Drohobych, he moved to Buczacz in the late 20s and was a teacher in the state gymnasium. He was transferred to Stanislav in 1938, then back to Buczacz. Was a Ukrainian patriot and a nationalist, considered Poland to be the colonizer of Ukrainian lands, and he also had a poor opinion of Jews. Now, World War II breaks out, and he wasn't too upset. The Ukrainians were not too upset, were they?
No, I mean, this is also interesting because, as I said, the Ukrainians in Galicia feel that they're under the Polish boot from 1921 to 1939. They really want to get rid of the Poles. And the Poles go against, say, cultural institutions, reading clubs, anything that promotes Ukrainian culture. So in 1939, when the Soviets come in, the Ukrainians initially are quite happy about it. A, because they're rid of the Poles, and B, because there is an idea that now Western Ukraine will be joined to the rest of Ukraine, because most of Ukraine is in the Soviet Union. That's on the other side of this Buczacz River, right? If you look at the map, that's where most of Ukraine is. And so although it would be a Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine, not an independent Ukraine, all Ukrainians would be in the same political entity. By 1941, the Ukrainians are not as happy with the Soviets as they were when the Soviets came in, because the Soviets do what the Soviets do. They nationalize the economy, so the economy is a disaster. They change the entire educational system. So for a teacher like Petrakevich, that's terrible, because there's no textbooks, everything is being messed up. Because by and large, he feels that the Russians are taking over, not just the Soviets, but the Russians, that there's a Russification of Ukraine. So again, Ukrainian culture is not being preserved. So in 1941, when the Germans come, again, the Ukrainians are not at all unhappy. They are happy that the Soviets are out, and they believe.
Okay, let's just get to that part where we finish the Soviet occupation.
Sure.
Okay, there was this malicious joke told about the Soviet occupation in June of 1940 in Buczacz.
Yeah.
Everybody has achieved their desires. The Ukrainians have Ukraine. The Jews, who had always complained that they could not get government positions, now fill government offices everywhere. And the Poles, who lamented that they had no trade of their own, are now selling their belongings in the flea market.
Yes.
This sort of like paraphrases everything that was going on about.
Exactly, because there's Schadenfreude, right? I mean, the Ukrainians are certainly happy that the Poles, who were bossing it over them, now are not being treated as well by the Soviets. The Soviets were very suspicious of Poles, and there were massive deportations of Poles by the Soviets between 1939 and 1941, because they were afraid of Polish nationalism, and that it would undermine their own rule there. And the Ukrainians are quite happy about that. The Jews, one has to understand, on the one hand, Jews in this area are targeted by Soviets for two reasons. One, if they're Zionists, if they're politically active, and the Soviets don't like that. And two, because if they have stores, if they have businesses, the Soviets nationalize all of that and at times deport them for that. But on the other hand, Jews know what is happening on the other side of the border. They know what the Germans are doing to the Jews in German-occupied Poland. And so for them, being under Soviet rule is better than being under Nazi rule.
Right. And then the Germans invaded in July of 1941. Right. And there was much fighting in the town, but the diary has missing pages that his son tore out. Now, I have this question for you. The son said he tore out those pages because he was afraid of the Soviets reading his father's anti-Soviet writing. But we know there were Ukrainian pogroms against Jews at the time. Perhaps those pages were taken out because he spoke about Ukrainians killing Jews.
Yes, so he tears out two sections. And he does that. You said that the son kept the diary until 56. The son took over the diary in 56, where the father died, and then kept it until we got out the diary from him. And that's in the 2000s. So he just sat on the diary. But shortly after his father died in 1956, the KGB came for a visit. And they just came to say hello, because his father was a nationalist and they knew he was a nationalist. They didn't find the diary, but he was afraid that they would come again and search the house and find the diary. He didn't want to destroy the diary. So what he did, he tore out those pages that he thought were most compromising. And there are two parts that he thought would be compromising, apparently, because you can't get the story straight from him, it's more from the context. He took out those parts that covered the last months of Soviet rule. He was becoming increasingly anti-Soviet because of everything that was happening under Soviet rule. So he apparently tore out pages that were particularly critical of the Soviets. So that's one part. The second part he tore out is the first few months in Buczacz. He comes back to Buczacz, and then the Germans march in. So what he tore out is the first few months between July and October, November 1941. And that is a time in which not only was the Ukrainian violence against Jews, which we know from other sources, and I wrote about it in Anatomy of a Genocide, this is the only time in Petrakevich's life that he becomes also an official. He's in charge of regional education in Buczacz, not appointed by the Germans, but appointed by the temporary Ukrainian administration that is put up there, just as the Soviets leave. Now, we don't know exactly what he does in that capacity, but that's a very compromising position for him to have had once the Soviets came back after the war, and even subsequently in the 1950s. So the son tears out those pages, and when we re-meet Petrakevich at the end of 1941, he's just a teacher. He's no longer an administrator. But of course, these are two extremely important periods.
Right. And then the Germans come and things got pretty bad for the Jews right away. And some of it because of the Germans and a lot because of the way Ukrainians were behaving. In February of 1942, he laments that Buczacz doesn't have a ghetto like the other cities. And why are they allowing Jews to walk around? Tells you where his sentiments are. But one interesting thing that I found is he talked about the difficulty of getting news. And he didn't believe official reports. But somehow the Jews seemed to know more than they knew. And we learn from the third memoir why that was. And then I thought that was a beautiful way that the two memoirs relate to each other. And then we get to the auction of October 18th, okay? And I just want to say in September of 1942, he comments that he seems that the danger for the Jews has passed, and that the Jews gave a beautiful gold box to the Germans as a bribe. No hint at all that the Jews were being extorted by, the Judenrat was being extorted by the German occupiers. Do you think he was being cute or he was really ignorant?
It's a bit hard to say. I actually think it's somewhere in between. I think he says the Jews do what the Jews always do. They bribe the authorities, which is not objectively entirely untrue under these conditions. This was one way of dealing with the authorities. It was to give them something. And Jewish leaders were saying that. We acted as we always did, only we didn't know that the Germans would take the money and then kill us anyway. And I think he also doesn't quite know yet, because he writes elsewhere that he heard about the killing of Jews in Stanislav. And he's not sure whether to believe it or not, because the rumor is that over 10,000 Jews were killed in one day in the cemetery. And he's somewhat appalled by that, it seems, but he doesn't quite believe it. Because these people live in isolated towns, and there hasn't been that much killing in Buczacz itself. So I think he doesn't know. He's prejudiced, obviously. He's wrong, because soon thereafter they do kill. But it also reflects what the Jews were trying to do throughout this period. From the moment the Germans come until the killing begins, the Judenrat, the Jewish council, does try constantly to bribe the German authorities there, not only to prevent violence, but also, and that's part of the Jewish dynamic, to preserve those, to save those who can be saved.
Right, but they're also being extorted and blackmailed. Like,
yeah, of course.
Give us a list for deportations, right, or give us a certain amount of gold. Something like that.
And look, I mean, this is a situation of extortion. Objectively, the Jews know that if they don't do something, they will be killed. And so everything they do to save themselves is extorted. However, it does mean that some people are in a better position than others, even under those conditions. Yeah. And that, of course, is expressed also in these kind of donations.
Okay. So October 18th was the date of a big auction and mass shooting of Jews in Buczacz. Victor, in his memoir, casually remarks, it was a terrible day for the Jews. Yeah, thousands of Jews were murdered. I guess you could call that a bad day. He described how Jews were begging Christians to hide them. But then he said something interesting. He said that Jews were either killed or they were being deported to Belgium, which was an extermination camp, but that the Jews were electrocuted and not gassed. How do you think he learned that? How did that knowledge get it to him at that point in time?
So there were rumors everywhere. We know, for instance, Victor Klemper, who wrote this extraordinary diary during the war, a German Jew in Dresden, was writing about killing facilities in Auschwitz shortly before that began. And he was completely isolated. He had no access to radio, to newspapers. How did he know that? So there were rumors all over the place about ways in which Jews were being killed. And one strange, perhaps, but prevalent rumor was that they were being electrocuted. Where that comes from, who knows? It may come from the electric chair in America, some ideas that people had about how you kill. We don't know. But the concept of it is correct. That is, that Jews were being killed through modern means in large numbers. And that he is aware of. It's curious.
The place it was happening.
He knows of the place. He knows of the place. And, the German officers who were on the ground, who were sending Jews to that camp, when they were interrogated by the German police in the 1950s and 60s, They said, oh, we didn't know where they were going. Now, of course, they did, but they claimed that they didn't know anything. But the people on the ground who didn't have all the official information that the Germans had, they knew already then.
Right. And he ended his entry that day speaking about the weather. He said they hadn't had a lot of rain lately, and the harvest was not too good. It really sounds so cold-hearted, which brings me to another point, that these memoirs were distributed by the sons, right? The sons entered it, and the Antony's and Antoni's memoir was also. Now, did the sons think when they were publicizing these memoirs of their father that they were putting their fathers in a good light? Was this the vision in post-war Poland and Ukraine, that thinking this way about the Jews was somehow so typical that it was not be looked upon, frowned upon by other people reading this?
So look, I mean, I'll say two things about it. First of all, this shows you what the strength of a diary is, of something that is written in real time, that you get a certain sense of people's minds. It probably had Petrikevich been writing this in 1955, he wouldn't write in the same entry about the killing of the Jews and about the weather. But he's writing in real time. He's writing, yeah, they killed the Jews, it didn't rain, there may be a bad harvest. It's all part of an account. It tells you how he's thinking at the time. And that's very important, because we don't want to think that people can think that way. As for the sons, look, I mean, Stravinsky's sons appear not to have had any interest in their father's diary. They deposited it in the library. It was archived, and that was the end of it. I don't even know if they read it. I have no idea, but it was just lying around there. So although they were patriots, they fought in the Polish Legion, and he loves them no end. He's clearly devoted to his sons. He has all these spiritual visions of them. It's quite interesting, his own relationship to his sons. We don't know about their relationship to him after the war. And I suspect that if they read it, they were not that proud of some of what was there, and they didn't publish it. It just stayed in the archive until I published it. So it was never published. And maybe if he has some descendants, they may not be very happy with it. It is available now electronically, a digital version of the original manuscript. You can actually get it through the internet, but that's only recently. As for Petrikevich, his son also appears to have been ambivalent about the diary. He just sat on it. He didn't do anything with it. And we discovered about his son, who was living in Stanislav, through a friend who was living in Buczacz, who said, you know, this Petrikevich has a son, and I gather he has a diary. And so we went there, and he agreed to give us the handwritten diary of his father. Whether he read it or not, I'm not sure. You know, it's a handwritten document.
You heard anything back from him afterwards?
Well, it's a complicated story because I needed to get copyright from him. I was asking over and over, and he has vanished. And I think, as far as I know, he has passed away.
Oh, okay.
But he did not also initiate any publication whatsoever. So these are not people who were really. I think the point to be made is that neither the sons of Stravinsky nor Petrikevich's son really wanted to know that much about this period and what their fathers were doing, and they were happy just to let it lie.
So let's now move to the third part of the book. The third memoir, by Moshe Wiesinger, was written in Cyprus, where he was detained in a camp by the British for trying to enter mandate Palestine illegally. He was a 21-year-old radio technician when the Germans marched into Buczacz. He was living with his mother and younger brother, was a Zionist, a strong Zionist with older siblings living in Palestine. He lacked higher education, but if you read his memoir, you'll see that he truly did have literary talent. And he gives a horrific description of the first few days of the German invasion, the part that was ripped out of Victor's memoir, with looting and attacks on the Jewish people. You want to please describe a bit those days and who was doing the attacking and what was going on?
Yeah, so Wiesinger gives us a very detailed account, and there are not many of those. There are several other memoirs, but his is probably the most detailed. And what he shows is that as the Germans come in, it's actually even before the Germans come in, but as the Germans come in, as the military units keep going through the town and continuing to the east, Ukrainians, particularly Ukrainian nationalists and hooligans, some of whom can be identified from other sources as members of the Ukrainian Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, start taking revenge as they see it. They take revenge against former Soviet officials, Polish, Jewish, and even Ukrainian. And they also start just perpetrating violence against Jews as such. And they do everything that you can anticipate. That is, there's just random violence. There are rapes. They recruit Jews to do forced labor, needed or not needed. There's a lot of humiliation of people, of religious people and so forth, of women. They take them to clean streets, and everything that you can imagine occurs, including violence against religious symbols, such as attacks on the synagogue, on Torah scrolls. What is interesting here are two things that he talks about, which I find, because we know that this happened in many places. What's interesting and somewhat different is that when there's an attack on the synagogue, when the synagogue is being vandalized, and the Ukrainian nationalists carry Torah scrolls to the bridge over the river and start unrolling these scrolls into the water, on the other side of the river, there's a monastery. It's a famous 18th century Brazilian monastery. And the abbot of the monastery comes down and shouts at those people and tells them that they have no right. And, they're armed young men, right? He says, you have no right. This is sacrilege. And then he proposes to the heads of the Jewish community to store their holy books in the monastery and protect them. Now, of course, in the long run, these older religious leaders and some other members of the elite who are, let's say, of Petrakevich's generation, they cannot control this because the Germans are behind it. Once the Germans come, of course, the Germans won't let anybody protect the Jews. But it does show you also the change from people who are nationalists, maybe anti-Semitic, but they're not of the caliber of these young guys who are about to start the actual killing. So this is one thing that is really, I think, important in that moment as he describes it, Wiesinger, from the inside.
Right. They complained about the Torah scrolls, and I'm glad they did, and they stored them for safekeeping for the remainder of the war, but they didn't complain about the murders of the Jewish people themselves. Now, the Germans then called to collect all the radios. Moshe volunteers to go to the headquarters after the Germans came to his house and told his mother to have both sons report. He went himself, not with his brother. This is just one of the many close calls that Moshe had. Because he was a radio tech, they put him in charge of the mandated radio collection. Moshe hid parts in the cemetery and put together a good radio for himself to use. With this, he was disseminating information to the Jews through town, and the Judenrat helped him in that. Information was like gold then. And this is tying in to the second memoir when Victor was wondering, how did the Jews know everything? And now we hear, and this is an interesting way to see that the Jews had a way with that. But Moshe was not a big fan of the Judenrat, was he?
So yeah, I mean, this is also one of those very complicated things. On the one hand, he has many complaints about the Judenrat, and obviously for good reason, especially against the Ordnungsdienst, against the Jewish police. And he speaks about the Jewish police very bitterly. He has fights with them. He says about the one of the commanders of the Jewish police that he was just like the Germans or worse than the Germans, that he was walking around with a whip. And so he has many arguments with anyone who collaborates with the Germans. And there is, as I said earlier, a fair amount of that for both personal and collective reasons. But at the same time, he himself is connected to the Judenrat. When he's arrested, it's the Judenrat that gets him out. He knows all the people at the top, and they use his information. He comes to the Judenrat offices quite often, and so he himself, because he's a young, enterprising man, he has a radio, he's brave, and he also is connected to them. And he's not the only one. Many of the people I write there, and I write also in Anatomy of a Genocide, there were people who were Jewish policemen who later, and Jewish policemen were not exactly loved by the rest of the community, who later become partisans and are admired as partisans. So the connections between the groups are much more complex when you see it from the point of view of individuals rather than sort of from, 30,000 feet.
He had this conversation with a man named Cypher of the Judenrat.
Yes.
That struck me. And Moshe asked him why rich Jews were left off the list for deportation to labor camps. He was implying that Cypher was getting bribes. Cypher tells Moshe, when the Russians come, you can hang me. But before that happens, both of us will be lying on the Fedor in a mass grave. How soon do you think the Judenrat members knew what was going to happen?
It's hard to say, because I think they very early know one thing, because in August 1941, shortly after the Germans come in, the Germans surround or round up about 450 Jews, members of what they call the intelligentsia, which means lawyers, not doctors. They wanted to keep doctors, but lawyers and other people in the white-collar professions. They take out all the artisans or the craftsmen because they think they might need them. They take those 450 people, they imprison them for a day, they beat them up, the Ukrainians beat them up and humiliate them, and then they march them to this hill, to Fedor Hill, and they shoot them all. And so this first mass killing already makes it clear that there's a license to kill Jews. But after that, it takes another year, more than a year, before the mass killing in Buczacz begins. And so people living under these conditions would like to think that the worst is over. Would like to think, well, they're bad, they're mistreating us, they're sending us to labor camps, but, there was this one round of killing. Now, they meanwhile hear that things are much worse in other towns, and Buczacz is considered to be relatively safe. There are people who come to Buczacz because they think it's not as bad as in other towns, until the killing starts in Buczacz too. So people living under these conditions naturally would also want to believe the best, because the worst is unthinkable, that they would all be murdered.
Now, here's a part where the writing by Wisinger was so impressive in my eyes. He really made the reader feel the pain of the hunger that he had. For someone with a limited higher education, his writing was really heartfelt and superb in emitting these feelings. I urge you, the people watching this, to read this, to see that for yourselves. This is what he wrote about being hungry. When you are so hungry that nothing else matters, even the imminent threat of death seems to lose its importance. Everything is concentrated on one goal, to eat. But even more so, the pain that made me lose my mind was caused by seeing my mother suffering. Only those who have known this pain can understand these words. And I am writing this for those who have. Now, I just imagined him sitting in Cyprus behind barbed wire, writing these words and mourning his mother as he was writing this. Really, really powerful here. He went on dangerous raids, to collect wheat to try to feed his family. And then Moshe started to hear news of mass shootings in neighboring towns. Life depended on having good hideouts to protect one from roundups. When news reached neighbors of a good hideout that Moshe and his brother built, others came to want to use it too. Please describe the scene of what happened when Moshe's mother was taken away.
Well, they realize that they have to hide either outside of the town or build hideouts inside the town. Buczacz is built on hills, so in some cases it was somewhat easier to dig into the side of the mountain rather than only down into their basements. But in their case, they prepare a hideout, but when they hear that there is going to be a roundup, it turns out that there won't be enough room in that hideout for everyone, because some neighbors come in and they all want to hide in that hideout. So Wiesinger and his brother and some other young people try to find a rescue in a nearby village. And they say, you hide there and we'll go elsewhere. When they get to that village, the woman in the village that they thought would hide them says she won't do it. And so they go to the cemetery, to the Catholic cemetery, where they know they had a hideout in the past. The problem is that there's a snowstorm and they're afraid that because of the snow, it would be easy to trace them to where they are, but they have no choice, so they hide there. The snowstorm is so bad that it covers up all the traces of their own footprints. And the next day, when the roundup is over, they go back to the hideout and they realize that it was discovered. And the two boys, these two brothers, Wiesinger and his younger brother, are totally devastated. They are suddenly left entirely alone. They have no father. Their older siblings are in Palestine. And they are young, strong men. They're very attached to their mother. And they just, for a few days, they are completely devastated. They cannot do anything. And he has very moving descriptions of how he tries.
Beautifully written.
How he tries to comfort his brother as they're lying in this house that is now empty because their mother is gone. So yes, these I find that he manages, after the war, he worked as a film machine operator for many, many years. So he screened films in Israeli cinemas after the war. This was his job. Wow, and so it's really interesting because he would watch, right, all these movies every night that he would screen. And the way he tells his story is somewhat cinematic in that sense. You can really see the action, whether it is these horrible, painful moments or when he describes later on the battles he's in. He has a wonderful way of compressing a moment on the text.
Now, the brother eventually, right after this, caught typhus, and they were hiding out in the cemetery with the help of the undertaker. And Moshe got his brother a job as an electrician, which got him a W tag, that tag was a lifeline to save him from future roundups. And eventually Moshe even used that idea of the tag, saying he had it with very quick thinking to save him after he was arrested. But the roundups continued, and it got to the point where there were very few Jews left. And Moshe's brother bought a pistol and hid out in work tunnels. And then there was Moshe heard about it later. He didn't know about it when it happened. But you wanted to describe the scene of how the brother was killed?
Yes, so we are talking now about the sort of final roundup. This is the Judenwein, as it was called, the making the city clean of Jews. So everyone, including the Jews, called it the Judenwein. There is mass killing in the town. Moshe succeeds in getting away. He is supposed to meet another friend to whom he gives his pistol. He also has a pistol. And when he goes to meet this friend, in the middle of the night, he discovers that his friend had been shot. He finds him lying down dead, but the pistol is gone. And so he runs to the cemetery because that's where he thinks he can still hide. This is where he hid at the beginning. This is where they hid when his mother was killed. And this is where he goes to the Catholic cemetery, which is right there. I mean, it's on the slope of
the house was right next to it.
Sorry?
His house was right nearby the Catholic.
Yes, their house is very close to the cemetery. And so he runs to the cemetery and he hides there. Some of the killing is still going on. And he does not know what happened to his brother. He hears that there was a killing in the work site where his brother was employed. So his brother was employed in a site where the Germans were trying to rebuild the tunnel, the railroad tunnel that the Soviets had blown up. And he hears that there was a firefight and that somebody shot with a pistol and then ran away. And he thinks this must have been his brother. And as he's lying there, the wife of the undertaker in the cemetery comes to him. She's Ukrainian. And she says, you have to leave here. The Germans are coming. They will kill you. And they will also then kill us. Now, this undertaker and his wife, the undertaker is Polish, his wife is Ukrainian, had been hiding Jews there. They hide another family that I know a fair amount about, and one of them I interviewed because he was living in Israel. He, I believe, died a few years ago. And Moshe says, but I have no place to go to. And she says, well, I think you might as well give yourself up. It's the easiest way to go.
Yeah, well, the interesting things happened between Moshe and her later on.
Yes, exactly. And so at that point, they also tell him that apparently his brother had died. He does not know for sure, but the combination of factors, his brother died, it's his only surviving family member. The Jewish community, everybody that he knew, all those people that he was still with, they've all been killed. There's hardly any survivor at all. And the fact that those people that he knew, the undertaker and his wife, the undertaker used to play soccer with him when he was a kid. They were friends. That they tell him, we cannot hide you. He does not know what to do. It's the moment I think of his greatest crisis. And it's also a moment of transformation. It's a moment where he has to decide, do I just give up? Do I do what she told me and just give up? Because where can I go? How can I live? Or do I insist on surviving? And he makes a decision.
I think it's very powerful words that he wrote. And when he was feeling suicidal and at the depth of his despair, as often happens to human beings from the depth of despair, an urge to revolt, a rejection of these circumstances arises. The fear of death and the hopelessness disappears and other thoughts fill the mind. After all, you are dead anyway. You have nothing to lose. Every hour, every minute of your life is a battle won against the Germans. And this really helps him to go forward, this attitude that he had. And then he learned about Jews that were hiding in other fields. And he goes there and he meets the Jews, and he feels better. He feels less lonely because he was hiding out in wheat fields during the day and sleeping in barns at night. And then eventually he meets two partisans, and they interview him. He talks to them, and they accept him, and he joins them. And this really brought about a change. It lifted up his spirits, both physically and emotionally. You want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, I think what is so important in this part of the diary, and maybe one of the reasons that I chose this one, apart from the fact that it's a substantial piece of writing and it's very well written, is that the second part is quite unique. Wiesinger it survives because Poles and Ukrainians help him. Without that, he wouldn't survive. As he runs away from the cemetery, he is attacked by some Ukrainian nationalists. They almost kill him. He tries to sort of persuade them that his father was actually a fighter with the Ukrainians. He manages to escape, and he goes to his Polish friends in a nearby village right next to Buczacz, and they hide him. They feed him. He hides in the fields because he can't hide in their homes, but they feed him, they take care of him, and then they tell him that there are a few more Jews living nearby. And he, until that point, believes that he's the only surviving Jew. And once he hears that there's actually other people there, he dashes off there, he finds those Jews, they're also living in the fields, they are also being helped by Poles. It's actually a well-known village near Buczacz where there are a number of Polish families that saved many Jews. This was mostly, not purely, but mostly a Polish village. And there's an old woman there that he calls grandma. They all call her grandma. She makes food for them. She cooks for them. She complains all the time. She says, oh, I don't have enough food for you. And she feeds them every day. And it's through them that he then gets connected to a Polish underground group that is distantly related to the Polish Home Army, to the Armia Krajowa, which was a big Polish underground organization. And these few surviving Jews join the Polish underground and fight with them. And that is a second transformation in Wiesinger, which to my mind is really important because he speaks about himself. He's transformed from somebody who's hunted into a hunter. He's transformed into a fighter. He hears that people are afraid of him, that mothers say to their children, if you don't eat food, the bearded Jew from the forest will come. And for him, this makes him into a person. He stops being this animal that is being hunted, and he becomes again a fighter. He reasserts his own humanity in this way.
Yes, and those partisans were led by a Pole named Edek.
Yes.
And Edek was a remarkable man really. And I was struck by this conversation that he had with Edek when Moshe was telling him about, the people who were threatening to betray him and this and that. And they said, well, so what? Edek asked him, so why did you accept that? Why didn't you kill him? He goes, I didn't have any weapons. He said, you had a match, didn't you? Sure. You had a match. And Moshe gets drawn to Edek, and they start having raids. And one person that they go to beat up is this Marinka, the wife of the undertaker, who was so not, who the husband was so nice to him, and the wife stopped that and threatened to betray him. And then Edek said to the wife, as she was pleading for her life after getting beaten up, he tells her that if you are afraid of what the Germans will do to you for helping Jews, you should be much more afraid of what we will do to you if you betray them. Now, I was thinking, where were these voices during the Shoah? Where were these Christian voices of people talking like that? This edict was a remarkable man who met, sadly, a bad end. The group of edict's partisans joined up with a large Soviet group of partisans that they met in the woods. Those partisans were led by a lieutenant colonel who really, they had their own society. They had trials for people they attacked. They rendered and carried out verdicts, which they posted in town. And the peasants, the ethnic Germans and the Ukrainians grew to fear them much. Now, describe the life of the peasants that were caught between the Germans asking for their wheat and the partisans attacking them for food and feeding the Germans.
Yeah, so, Wiesinger describes this also with a lot of understanding, because this is not only...
Gives the reader empathy for the...
Yes. Yeah, and this is not only in the case of what is happening in Western Ukraine at that time. You can find it in many, many other places, certainly in cases of insurgency, where people are caught in between. You have a poor village. The people, they hardly have enough food for themselves. They basically, sell the wheat that they grow. And then the Germans insisted, and that's something that Petrikevich writes on as well, the Germans insist on contributions by the peasants who hardly have any food to send this food to Germany, because Hitler saw Ukraine as the breadbasket of Germany. And so they have contingents, as they call them. They come and they just take food from the peasants. And the peasants don't want to do it, but they have no choice because they will kill them. The partisans, however, come to them and say, if you give food to the Germans, we'll kill you. And they do that. So they will either burn down an entire village or kill the village chief. And so the peasants are caught between the two. And he talks about the mentality of the peasants. Edek sort of tells him about it. And he says, these are people who have always been bossed by others. When they see someone in a uniform with shiny buttons, they will do anything. They will hate them. They may stab them in the back when they turn, but they will always be subservient, because for generations they have lived like that. They're poor, they're uneducated, they're wretched. Yeah.
So Moshe wound up breaking his leg, falling off a horse, and he had to be hidden in the safe houses. But he was itching to get back in the fight. His friend Nasio died in a raid to kill the feared German Paul, who was wounded but survived. Now, one of the angriest feelings that I had reading the book, and there were many, regarded this man Paul, who was later decorated for bravery and was a policeman in post-war Germany before being indicted in 1970. He died before facing justice. Tell us a little bit about Paul.
Well, Peter Paul, I write about him more in Anatomy of a Genocide, and I sort of read all his record. He is a typical example of a German policeman who became involved in killings, who otherwise, under other circumstances, would just have been a local policeman. He was a policeman before the war. He became a gendarme, a sort of local uniformed policeman in Buczacz. He had, as he says, he had a very good time in Buczacz. There was a lot of free booze and he liked drinking. You could get as much food as you liked. He had a Ukrainian girlfriend. And you could exercise as much violence as you liked. When he talks about himself, Paul, he says, well, I didn't hate Jews. The Judenrat loved me. For my birthday, they would come and bring me a cake. when I came to visit this Dr. Zeifer that you mentioned earlier, his wife always had red wine for me and sardines, which was very hard to come by at that time. You know, sardines from Portugal, World War II, is in Ukraine. They liked me very much. Now, of course, they were terrified of him because, in fact, he would kill, he would drink, and then he would kill not only on orders, but just because he could. And even some of the other gendarmes were particularly afraid of this man.
Amazing that Germany would give him a medal for bravery.
He, by the way, he gets a medal for bravery, possibly because of the same incident that Wiesinger described. So the way Nacho, his best friend, dies is that they go to a town, to Monastejiska, near Buczacz, and they hear that Pal is there, and Pal was there at the time. This was the town that he was also the main policeman in. And so they want to kill him. But as they try to kill him, a group of Germans opens fire on them. They wound him, and Nacho is injured and subsequently dies of his injuries. Pal does not die of his injuries. He survives his injuries. And apparently that's why he gets a medal, because he shot back against partisans. He takes this medal and goes back to Germany and serves as a policeman for the rest of his career, retires honorably, and only after that is he indicted by the West German police, and he cannot be found guilty because he dies before they can find him guilty.
Yeah, that's why I said it's one of the things that made me the angriest. Yeah. Now, Zionism and settling in Eretz Yisrael after the war was a big inspiration to the Jews. Moshe was given a Palestine postage stamp by a girl named Hanya that he kept close to him at all times. And he describes the scene very emotionally when Nacho was dying. He took out the stamp, and Nacho told him to kiss the land of Israel for him when he gets there. And again, you can imagine in Cyprus, Moshe so close to Israel, writing these words and thinking of his friend Nacho, and how much it meant for Jews there to be able to settle in Eretz Yisrael. Very, very powerful writing there. Okay, eventually his leg healed and he joined partisan groups in many revenge attacks. Soviets came and liberated Buczacz. 800 Jews came out of hiding. Then the Soviets retreated. You think Moshe retreated with them. The Germans reoccupied, and 700 out of those 800 Jews were then killed. What were the circumstances of that?
Yeah, this is one of the most tragic moments in the story of Buczacz, because when the Soviets returned to Buczacz for the first time in March 1944, about 800 Jews come out of hiding, either bunkers inside the town or in surrounding villages. And that's considered to be a relatively high number for survivors. Of course, there were 8,000 Jews in Buczacz before the war, and about 10,000 were killed in Buczacz or taken to Birkelund because Jews were brought from the outside as well. So it's not such a high percentage, but it's considered to be quite high, and there were various questions as to why was that possible. But the Jews who come out of hiding have, of course, been hiding under very difficult conditions for months and months. And so they're emaciated, they can hardly walk. They do not have time to recover when the Red Army makes a tactical retreat. Now, for the Red Army, this is just a retreat a few miles because they want to straighten the line of the front. They're surrounding other German units further north. But for the people in Buczacz, this is a catastrophe because most of the Jews cannot run away with the Red Army. The Red Army is not exactly, doesn't have much time for them or patience for them. And these are only small Red Army units at that point. They just say, you know, hide for a few days and we'll be back. But in fact, they don't come back until July. The Jews cannot go back to the hiding places because now they're known. They've come out of their hiding places. They're out in the open. And the German unit that comes in is an SS division. And so they start hunting the Jews. And within a short period of time, they kill most of the Jews. Those who manage to escape to other villages are, as I said earlier, often killed in this period by locals. They're killed for money, they're killed for greed, they're killed just because they can be killed. And so less than 100 actually survive.
I can't imagine the pain to have survived so much and then to think you were liberated and then be murdered.
Yeah.
How awful. I just have a few final questions about Moshe's life in Israel after the war. I don't know, because it wasn't in the book, and I don't know how much you actually know about his Israeli life. I assumed he arrived in Israel right after the declaration of the state. Is that true?
I'm not sure when, but I think he may have arrived even before the War of 1948.
So did he fight in the War of 1948?
I don't know. I wish I did. I don't know. I'm sure he would have liked to, because he was a fighter.
Right. That's why I asked. Do you know where he lived? You said he was a projectionist, or
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I'll tell you what. Something very curious happened about 2 months ago. I got an email from somebody called Wiesinger, and now Moshe lived to his 90s, Moshe Wiesinger. I got an email from somebody who said that he read Anatomy of a Genocide. This book, my last book, Voices on War and Genocide, had not been published yet. And he said, I'm Moshe's son. And he always told me about those times, and I was so happy to hear that you write about him in Anatomy of a Genocide. And so I wrote him back. I said, yes, but I'm bringing out his entire diary. And this son, as far as I could tell, he didn't quite admit that, but I don't think he ever read that diary. The diary is written in Polish. It was not translated to Hebrew or English. And so he grew up hearing these stories from his father all those years.
I wonder how much he actually spoke and shared, because as we know, a lot of survivors did not share a lot.
It sounds to me like he did. And you can tell also from his writing. I mean, he seems to be somebody who likes to talk about it. And I think he was ultimately proud also of what he did, rightly. But my impression is that he lived a pretty humble life. A projectionist is not, certainly not in Israel, the 50s and 60s. You didn't make a lot of money working in that position. He was, by the way, a revisionist. So unlike the image that we have of the Zionists, or the image that I grew up in Israel, that they were all socialists, Shomer Tzair, he was not. He was with the revisionists, and he always was.
Beitar, right?
Beitar, and his there is a very tiny dossier about him in the Jabotinsky house.
Have you heard anything about his brother and sister that came to Palestine before the war?
I really tried, but these were, he seems to have been the only member of his family who had this ambition to write and to record. What is so interesting is, there's a book that a Polish man published in the United States about 10 years ago. This is a Polish man from Buczacz who lived there in the 1930s, went to the high school in Buczacz. And it's a very interesting book about the town, but among other things, he says, in Yad Vashem, he writes, there is a diary by Moshe Wiesinger that is a really interesting diary, and nobody knows about it. Nobody published it. So when I read this Polish guy, I thought, well, okay, I'll do it.
Okay, good. Well, Omer, I want to thank you for spending time with us today. This conversation, I think, has been great. I feel privileged to be a part of it with you. I also want to thank you on behalf of Gesher Galicia and as the child of a survivor. Your work makes us proud. Yasher Koch.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Okay. And to our viewers there, I want to thank Charlie Katz for moderating this, and we will have a handout with links where you can buy Omer's books. Bye.
Thank you.